Hey there, fellow real estate aficionados. Welcome back to the House of Horrors podcast, where each week we dive into real estate investing situations that have gone terribly, horribly, sometimes hilariously wrong. I'm your host, Bonnie Galam, your trusty real estate attorney friend who loves guiding you through the maze of real estate's darkest corners, shady dealings, and the legal potholes in between. This week, I'm really excited to be joined by my friend Sarah Weaver. We go way back in, I guess, Instagram world. We've collabed on a few things in the past. She's just an amazing person, coach, world traveler, although she might be settling down, or at least I think this is the first time we've ever talked where you are physically located in the United States. And so I just don't know what to make of that other than we have a great internet connection right now. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Yes, I vividly remember where we recorded our first podcast. I was sitting on the floor in an Airbnb that I was renting in Queenstown, New Zealand. And it's funny how some conversations you just like remember. And I remember I had you like on a top of my suitcase and I was sitting like my butt on the floor.
I remember it was 2020, so it was during the pandemic. And I remember we
Yep.
got introduced. I couldn't tell you by who. And you're like, I'm stuck here because there's no flights. Like the whole country is like on quarantine. You can't go out and you can't come in. And you were there for a really long time. Like you were planning on only being there for like a few weeks and you were there for months, weren't you?
Yeah. So what happened when the US closed the borders in March 13, 2020? I wrote in my journal, like, best place to be trapped in during a pandemic. And I was currently, at the time, I was in Malaysia having a girls' weekend, as you do. And I was like, oh my goodness. I had this visual in my mind. It was like of a globe. And I was like, countries are just going to be like closed, closed, closed. And so I was like, oh, I need to pick like what country am I going to go to? And I applied for a working holiday visa to New Zealand. I got accepted within 6 hours. I got the email and I was on a plane like 12 hours after that with just a 90-day tourist visa. So I thought I had 90 days. I didn't think I was one of those people that was like, this thing is not going to be over in 90 days. I think a lot of people were like, oh, this will be done by May or April.
Two
No,
weeks.
I don't know why I thought that. I guess because I had experience traveling during SARS. And so I was like, no, this is not going to be like a 2 week thing. Also, on that side of the world, I mean, we had been talking about COVID since before New Year's. And so, like, COVID was not new to us in March, right? It just, the US got the memo.
Yeah, the
And
US thought that Customs and Border Patrol at the airport was just going to be like, not here. Believe it or not, that's not how viruses work.
and
No,
so,
I just
yeah,
read
so
this book. I was going
go
to say
ahead.
called Station 11, which is
Ooh.
written pre-pandemic. It was written in like 2014, and it's about a worldwide pandemic. And all I have to say is thank the sweet Lord that I did not read this prior to 2020 because I would have lost my mind, packed my children up in a car, and like drove into the woods because had a
Wow.
very different outcome than it was basically the full collapse of society. It was just wild reading it
Well,
now in like
it was
2024.
probably based off of SARS. Like SARS was back when I was in like 2002 to 2003. And yeah, it was a huge, huge deal.
I think it
And
really was because they mentioned SARS. They said it was a flu-like virus, and they're talking like in the beginning. I'm not giving anything away if you haven't read this book. You know all this in like the first 5 pages. They're running out of ventilators, and I'm like, oh my god, we were running out of like it was just this similarity to like how COVID rolled out, and thankfully that's not ultimately what happened. We didn't have a complete societal collapse, but just bonkers.
yeah, but it's been really interesting. So like fast forward years later, and now I'm traveling to conferences. My dad said something funny the other day. He said, Sarah, you meet more people in a month than some people do in a lifetime. And I think about like my grandparents living in like, a town of 1,000 people. And I'm like, wow, I probably meet more people in 1 month than some people do in a lifetime. In that time frame, I really just quarantined. I was just like spending so little time in, society. Like we just lived our own little world in New Zealand. And now that I'm going to these conferences, I'm hearing so many stories of people's pandemic or COVID experiences, whether they were now newly working from home and their husband's working from home and their kids are in the home, and it was just mass chaos. And I think people experienced a lot of trauma and like hard times. And I just like sip my coffee and I'm like, oh yeah, the pandemic, that was tough because I didn't experience it. I was living my best life. I had bought a van in New Zealand. They just kept extending my visa. And I just like lived in this little bubble. I was attending every Zoom mastermind about real estate investing that I could attend. And I joke that year is like when I got my master's in investing because I just attended and read and listened to every podcast. And I had a great pandemic and I feel guilty about it. So I don't talk about it very often. I don't bring it up while people are sharing their trauma. I'm just like, yes, yes.
Oh, well, congrats to you. I had a newborn and a toddler and a business to run and unsure that like rent was ever going to be due again. And I'm like, well, this is it. This is the end.
It
We
was
all
wild.
pulled through it. And I guess, a silver lining is that we got to meet each other.
Yeah.
So now that everyone has the full backstory on how Sarah and I came to be, Sarah has a really interesting story that she wants to share with today. I do want to put a trigger warning in. It does involve suicide. And so if that is a topic that is sensitive to you for any number of reasons, go ahead, skip past this episode. We would love to have you in another horror story. This one's a little bit different than some of the other ones I've shared in the past, which are a little bit more legal and I'll say less triggering than the topic that we're going to cover today. We love you and we'll see you in a different episode. So with that, Sarah, let's get into this horror story that you have. First, give a little bit more background on yourself. Where are you now as an investor?
Yes, thank you so much for the trigger. This is actually the first time I've ever told this story on a podcast, or really even more than probably like maybe 6 people have heard this story. So I feel ready. Enough time has passed. I'm ready to share this story. So as an investor, I am fully nomadic. So when Bonnie says world traveler, I am fully nomadic. I'm investing remotely in the Midwest. I own a bunch of duplexes and fourplexes. It is 8 buildings or 19 units, and half my portfolio is furnished. I love midterm rental, so much so that I wrote a book about it, published by Bigger Pockets, called 30 Day Stay. So I love a furnished rental. Half my portfolio is still unfurnished. We love a sit it and forget it long-term rental. I hope to pick up lots more of those. But right now, that is where my portfolio is today.
Very cool. I think that's probably quite a few more doors than you had. I think you were on the podcast way back when, probably in 2020. And so
Yeah,
if
I
you
think
guys want to go back,
I had 3.
this is your 3rd time on. Wow.
No, I'm saying I had 3 units back then.
Oh, you had 3 units back then. So
Yep.
I'll be sure to link the first episode that we had with Sarah back years ago, quite literally. And so if you love Sarah the way that I do, go back and give that episode a listen as well. And so
So this story, it's
how long ago did this story happen?
This happened the end of 2022. What happened was I actually happened to be at the unit next door, which is really rare. For the listeners, I try to spend as little time at my properties as possible. 1, I like keeping them really full. And 2, I just travel a lot. This year, I've been to like over 25 events in 7 different countries. And I'm just always traveling. And so the fact that I even was at the unit is really, really rare. And funny, I was being interviewed on a podcast. So I was sitting in a construction zone because that unit was under construction. That's why I was there. I was checking on some things and meeting some contractors. And I had just gotten off of a podcast and took my headphones out, started maybe making lunch, and I look outside and there are like at least 4 cop cars, an ambulance, and a fire truck. And I'm like, whoa, there must have been a really bad car accident on this. Like, I wouldn't say a busy, my properties are all in the Midwest, so busy street feels like a joke, but it was
speaking.
Relatively speaking, a busier street. And so I'm thinking, oh, wow, there must be a really bad car accident. So I go out, funny, and probably an outfit very similar to this, business on top, lounge on the bottom, house slippers. I open the door to the unit and then the door to the building, and I step outside. And there are at least 9 police officers, firefighters, emergency workers in the front lawn. And they are screaming, get back inside, get back inside. Unfortunately, I have been in an active shooter situation. And so I immediately am thinking this is an active shooter situation. I don't hesitate. I start to step back, but then I go, well, wait a minute. It looks like they're trying to get into my building. And I go, I'm the owner. And they look at me and I can, there's this hesitation. And then they're like, well, open the door. Well, the way that this building works is I don't have access to open the front doors from the outside. Every unit has their own access from the backside. So I grab my phone and I open the Schleg app and I open the door to the back door. And I tell the police, I go, the back door is open. And so they run to the back of the house or the building. I run inside and I put on, it's so funny what you do when you're in panic. I put on like real clothes, and tennis shoes in case I need a run. I go to the back of this unit and I crack open the door and I'm like, again, like, this is probably very stupid. Like, stop being so curious, right? Maybe it's better to like hide in the bathroom or something. But curiosity gets me and I open the back door and they enter the unit next door. And, they're like, police, police, police. They're like, if you're armed, put the gun down. I can hear all of this. All of a sudden, the police officers are like, their shoulders are down. They're all walking around. Like, immediately, the vibe is like, they're casually strolling. And that, I think, is the moment that I am like, there's a dead body. I think immediately there's no active shooter. They ever told me that there was, but that was my first thought. And then immediately I go, no one's in danger because of the body language of the police officers.
Right.
I feel this like pit in my stomach, like somebody's dead. I let them do their thing. I try my best to not be like, what's going on? Because they don't need that right now, right? So I just pour myself a glass of water. I'm trying to like calm down, breathe, think like, what do I do? And again, I don't know anything. And
this is a tenant occupied building. It's not like a vacant building.
correct. Yep, this is a tenant in my unit. I don't know the tenant, but there's a tenant in my unit. I hear commotion out the front of the building. And this, Bonnie, is the part where if I could do it all over again, I would have done this part differently. But I look outside and I start to see a stretcher. Again, I had never met my tenant before, but I recognize that that is him and he's alive. And I don't see any bodily injury. The only thing that I see is that he's struggling to breathe. Like, I still to this day can like see him like gasping for air. They take him away, they put him in the ambulance. I just sit down on the front porch and like try to like process what's going on. An officer tells me like, we'll get to you in a second. Like, we are going to need some information from you. I was like, okay. I kept thinking like, I can't believe I'm here. I can't believe I'm here. Like I said, there was no visible anything. Immediately I thought, well, I don't see any blood. So I assumed it was an OD situation. It turns out that they had gotten a call because that was the weirdest thing. I was like, I don't understand. Like, why did all these police officers
here?
How did they end up here? Because there was no noise, like there was no indication of like struggle or anything, right? And he was alone in the unit, I assumed. What had happened was he had called his ex-girlfriend and was more or less saying goodbye. And the moment that they either got off the phone or I don't know how that phone call ended, she called the police and told them to immediately report. Because of the Schleg app, I knew that he entered the building at this time. And then obviously I knew what time the cops had arrived. So we knew something had to have happened. It was a pretty short window. It was about a 45-minute window. They start to ask me all these questions. And the way that they were talking, I'm like, but he's alive. And they're like, he is, but he's probably not going to make it. And I think that hit me so hard. I'm like, wait, what? Like, what do you mean? Like, he just got taken away on a stretcher. He's going to be fine. And they're like, we can't guarantee that. And then they asked me, did you hear a gunshot? And I go, no. And again, like I said, I was on a podcast, but no, I don't have magic noise canceling headphones. I would have heard. And they were like, well, we recovered a gun. I was just like, wait, what? So then your mind starts going to like, oh my God, what does my unit look like? Now I know why you like really think he's not going to make it. But again, I'm like, I saw him. Like, I've watched, I guess, enough terrible movies that I thought you would see worse things. It was really clear that that is exactly what happened. He shot himself in the bathtub and he was still breathing and he was alive when they got there, which is why they took him to the hospital. And they were correct. He did later die in the hospital. Then I was tasked with like, what do you do? The first person I called was my insurance broker. Close. I was like, Doug? And Doug answers the phone. Oh, where in the world are you? Which is how most people answer the phone when they call me.
It's how we started the Zoom call today. Yeah.
Everybody. No one asked me, how are you? They asked me, where are you? And I was like, Doug, something bad has happened. And I told him and he goes, unfortunately, like I've dealt with this before. Like he was like, first of all, are you okay? I was like, I think so. I don't know how to answer that question. And I was like, what do I do? And he just told me like the steps to take and what to do and make sure you are documenting everything. And I was like, okay. And he's like, you need to call a restoration company. I was just like, oh my gosh, this feels so like robotic and insensitive and all these things. I start to do all of these things. I asked the detective. It's so funny. I'll never forget what the detective looked like because he looked like an actor. He showed up. He was this like very attractive black man with a beard, tight-fitting jeans and a clipboard. And he was like, hello. I was like, hi. And I asked him, I said, how bad is the unit? He goes, honestly, it's really not that bad. And I was
Oh.
like, okay. I was like, should I go in there? And he goes, I would not go in there. I'm like, okay, those feel very counterintuitive. Like, it's not that bad, but you're telling me don't go in. I wait, and the restoration company comes the next day. They go in and they're like, oh, it's not that bad. And I had a friend with me at this point, and she works in the hospital. And so she's super curious and I guess likes gruesome things. So she's like, I'm going to go look. So she goes and she looks and she comes out and she's like, honestly, Sarah, I bet what you're imagining is way worse. So if you think it would be better for your like mental state to see it, it really isn't that bad. And I won't go into the details, but I will say, like, it wasn't that bad.
Had a homicide occur in one of our units a few years ago, and it was wild because we didn't find out through the police. Ultimately, the police did, get a hold of us and let us know what happened, but we had just like the news on in the background, and they said there was a shooting at, the 3500 block or whatever the street is, and we're like, oh, we've got a building on the 3500 block of that street. Like, not even just connecting. And then
Mm-hmm.
ultimately we found out it wasn't our tenant. It was her boyfriend got shot by someone who had come to the property. And the cleanup there was quite intensive. I mean, it could have just been the location of it, but we had to get hazmat involved. It was on carpet. And so I think all those things can make a difference. And I don't mean to talk about this subject insensitively.
I want to echo that too. First of all, this is the first time I've ever told this story. But yeah, nobody take like what I'm saying as crass. Like, it was an incredibly emotional and incredibly traumatic experience for me. I mean, it's been 2 years. I've had a lot of time to think about it and talk about it to my therapist. But yeah, as an investor, it's really interesting. You have to put on a different hat. And so in your situation, I think you shift from being like, this is a person, to being like, I have a responsibility to the other tenants and the building, that I have to do something about this now.
Yeah. And sometimes you're dealing with next of kin. I know with us, we did that. Like I said, there's people who have suffered a much greater loss than like we ever could with our experience involving, this crime in a much more tangential way than the people who are more directly affected by, someone either taking their life or losing their life. It's a very weird thing to think about it, but it is something that, unfortunately, like, death is something that kind of touches this business, and
Yes.
knowing how to navigate, like, what are the calls to make? What are the steps you have to do? Because I mean, we didn't even think like hazmat. And then I think our first call was to insurance broker as well. And they said, this is not really so much, there's not like a claim so much to be made here. It probably wasn't financially worth it to make any sort of claim, but here's the connections that you need to have made. And ultimately for us, the tenant was still living there, but for understandable reasons, she no longer wanted to live there. I mean, we just kind of let her out of the lease. We're like, whenever you want to go, you can go. But like, she's like, I can't come back to this place. They're business decisions, but they're very much like touching
they're human
the
decisions
people
too.
who we're dealing with. Yeah. I guess what I want you as listeners to take away from this is the very real business decisions that have to be made. They're not easy. They can be, traumatizing. I mean, for Sarah to be so close to this incident as, when it happened, but it is something that you kind of have to like kind of contingency plan for, in the way that you have to think about like, well, how would I handle a fire or a flood? It's one of those kind of catastrophic things that really throw off what happens with a particular unit or a particular property. With that, I'll let Sarah continue on with her story, because I know this is not the end of it.
So I do go into the unit. Of course, I won't share the details of what I saw, but I will share this. On the table, there was a beautiful, like, stationary binded, like, something you definitely buy at like a Hallmark or like, a Target. And on the cover, it says, I'm dead, now what? And it was a pre-printed, like, fillable journal, essentially. And he had handwritten everything, his who to call, what to do with his cat. But yes, he had a cat. We'll talk about that. He had stuff. He had a car, his bank information, all of his passwords, login. I didn't know this, but he owned a home. So all of the loan information on his house, the utility companies for that house. It was completely planned. And I don't know why, but I think knowing that gave me a new perspective that this person was really hurting. Whatever your thoughts on suicide are, this was not a spontaneous act, right? This was something that was very pre-planned. I want to say I waited about 3 or 4 days, which someone advised me to do. And then I called who was on there. And it was, hi, I'm a landlord in X city. And she immediately was like, oh, honey. She was like, I'm so sorry. First of all, was like, oh, thank God that I'm not like delivering the news. And
Mm.
then second, I was so touched by her kindness and her consideration for me and my feelings. And she just profusely apologized and she verified what I had just thought, which is he was in a lot of pain. And this was his older sister, and they weren't surprised when they got the call. They're devastated, of course, but they weren't
Mm.
surprised. So we start talking about what do they want to do with the stuff? What do they want to do with his car? All of these things. And I was like, I'm not gonna like tow the car. I'm like, I don't know what to like
Yeah.
all these things. So
Right.
again,
In these situations, I feel like you kind of suspend what you would do in normal tenant operations, right? Like if I had a
yeah.
tenant just like abandon a car, I'd be like, do not pass go. I'm calling, Joe Schmo's towing company. I mean, probably give them a few calls, but like at some point you just kind of move on with it. And I feel like
Uh-huh.
when you're dealing with like some sort of tragedy, you're kind of just like balancing your needs with like the needs of the family and just like, how can I approach this with compassion?
Exactly. And I think as an investor, I think that's why it's so important to not live paycheck to paycheck.
Mm.
Like this unit being vacant or, whatever it wasn't going to affect the bottom line to an extent where I even needed to question how I was going to act, right? Like I'm someone that really values compassion, and that is how I perform not only as a person, but also as a landlord. So I think that that's really important to note. So we had a plan in place. We start going through the motion of what to do. I was really not looking forward to packing up his things, but I didn't want to put it on my cleaner, who I like know, love, and respect. I was like, okay, like I own this building. Like I can do this. I'm going to put my like big girl pants on and some gloves. By this point, the unit is completely restored, I should say, as far as
Mm.
like the cleanup. So we're just talking about his personal belongings that were in the living room, the dining room, the kitchen, the bedroom, like the unaffected areas, we can call it. And so I've been putting it off for a few days. But like I said, I was in town working on renovating the next door unit. And this is where the story gets a little crazy. So buckle your seats, okay? So I am in the basement, unfinished basement of the building, doing something unrelated to that unit. And I hear footsteps and I freeze. I first go to touch my pockets. I realize I left my phone up in my unit. So I have no phone, no one, like no way to contact. And I'm not crazy. I absolutely hear footsteps. Like this is not a ghost story. I
Oh, I thought
hear
that's where this was going. I'm like, oh my God, because Sarah didn't tell me the story before ahead of time. So I don't know exactly where this is going. And I was like, holy shit, Sarah's telling a ghost story. It's literally a house of
I
horrors.
I hear footsteps. And at first, of course, I'm like, am I insane? Like, is it a ghost? But I'm like, no, identify that it's probably two people. And I'm like, holy shit, what do I do? And my business partner walks into the basement and she's like, hey, Sarah, da 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 da. She's just chatting. And I go, shut the fuck up. She says, shut the hell up. That's what I say to her. And she looks at me like, what did you just say to me? And I point and I go, listen. And I point to the ceiling and she looks like she saw a ghost. She was like, oh my God, what do I do? And I go, get your phone and call 911. And she does the same thing I did. She touches her pocket. She goes, I don't have my phone. I'm like, okay, we're going to very quietly walk up the stairs of the basement outside and go get our phones. And so we run into my unit, call 911, and they tell us, they're like, get out of the building. And we're like, okay. So we get out of the building, we run kind of 50 feet away and we hide behind these cars. By the way, this is not my brightest moment. Like, this is not what you should do. Do not take this as advice. And this was dumb. So we hide behind these cars, and I kid you not, I'm looking at the back window of the unit and I see fingers pry open the blinds and I see eyeballs looking out. So now I know I am not crazy. There's absolutely a human in this unit. And the first thing that I think is someone was listening to the police scanner and they're robbing the place, which is where
Mm,
my
like they
mind
know it's
went.
a vacant place and they're
Exactly.
coming.
They know it's vacant. So then I'm like, wait a minute, I have the Schleg lock. So I look at the Schleg lock and it has the tenant's name as if he opened it, meaning they used his code. So
Mm.
I'm like, oh my God, like somebody knew his code, is what I think. The police arrive. They come to us and we're like, there are people in the unit. And one of the cops is like, wait, I was just here the other day. I go, yes, this is like where the guy died. And now there are people in the unit and there should not be people in the unit. Like, I do not know these people. This is not someone I know.
Mm.
And they go, okay. So they knock on the door with their guns drawn. And I open the door with the Schleg app. So they open the door, the cops open the door and they yell, police, police, put down your weapons. And these girls are screaming with their hands up, don't shoot, don't shoot. It turns out that this is his coworker who had just went to the animal shelter to pick up his cat, because that's what happens is they remove the animals and they
Mm.
take the animals to a shelter. She had just picked up the cat and she was now at the unit picking up the cat's cat food and litter box.
Oh.
They're bawling. Me and my business partner are like wailing. So these two police officers have like four girls in their 20s and 30s just like hysterically crying. It was
Sarah,
so scary.
what? First of all, why were they being so sketch about it? And second of all, how did they like get their code? I mean, maybe I just don't know how other people live, but like I don't like give my house code to like even my house cleaner.
Oh, it gets worse. So literally, like I'm crying, they're crying, and I'm like, I'm so sorry. And they're like, we're so sorry. And the police officers, I remember standing there being like, well, I think you have the situation handled. And then they just walk away. So the women come out on the back porch, or the girls, I should say, and I'm just like, I'm so sorry. And she says, she goes, I'm his coworker, but I'm also his cat sitter. That's how I had his code, is I
Okay.
feed his cat when he has longer shifts, or like I take care of the cat from time to time. So Sarah, I hadn't heard from him for a few days. And when he didn't show up for work today, I came to the unit to check on him.
Oh, so like his work didn't even know at that point.
This was his like best friend at work, his coworker best friend and his cat sitter. And
How did she know the cat was in the shelter?
this was earlier that morning, like
Mm.
hours earlier, and I obviously didn't hear her. She went into the unit. The unit hadn't been cleaned yet. So she saw all the blood in the bathroom. And that is how she found out that her coworker and friend was probably dead. So the first thing she does is she calls all the hospitals and then she
Mm.
calls the police station. And that's when she finds out what happened. And that's when she finds out where the cat is. And because she's a good person, she went and got the cat.
Poor woman.
When she's telling me this story, I can't even control myself. I'm like hysterically crying as she's telling me this story. And I'm just like, I'm so sorry. Emotions are very high. And the blessing that came from this is she said, do you want me to pack up his things? And part of me wanted to be really kind and be like, you don't need to do that. But I
Mm.
was like, yes, like please pack up his things. And so her and her friend stayed there for probably like 6 hours. They
Oh,
kept texting
wow.
me. They're like, hey, sorry, we're taking forever, like opening up his things and like
Mm.
reminiscing. And they're like, we're so sorry it's taking so long. And I'm like, oh my God, like take all the time you need. They pack
Right.
up everything so nicely into boxes, and they even moved them to the basement without me asking. And they pack up all of his things, and then they even call the sister and ask if they can take his car and park it in front of their house so that it's no longer my problem. And I am just like, even telling the story, I'm like, I cannot believe how graceful and kind these people
I can
were.
tell you're like choked up telling this.
Yeah, like they were so considerate. And I'm sure meeting me and realizing that I'm probably like about the same age as them, that like I'm not some like scummy landlord, like I'm just a girl. I think that they like treated me with kindness. And it just was like, wow, like I cannot believe that situation like panned out the way that it did. Yeah, I think that that's the end.
Is there anything you do differently now as a landlord having experienced this? I mean, you
I
never
don't
want to
know.
plan for something like this, but I'm wondering, and
Yeah,
maybe
I guess
you
that's
don't
a
do anything different, but maybe you think about being a landlord differently.
I think what that did for me as a person is it reminded me something that I already knew, which is like everybody is fighting battles.
Mhm.
Like I unfortunately lost my grandmother this year, and somebody treated me badly shortly after and I almost lost it on them. Thankfully, I didn't. I had self-control, but it just was a reminder that like you never know what people are going through. And I think as a person, that is a really good thing to spend life doing. Like when somebody cuts you off in traffic, instead of being like that jerk, like just thinking like that person may be having an issue or a really bad day, or, instead of jumping to something really negative. I think that was my human response. And as a landlord, I really embrace what I call just in time learning. So I think a lot of investors, we were talking about this earlier, like in the green room, about people that have, they take all these courses, they take your course, they take my mastermind, they read all the books, they attend all the conferences, and they don't buy real estate. They're using education as procrastination. I really believe in just in time learning. Did I, as a landlord, know what to do in that situation? Absolutely not. I had no idea what to do. And so I just called the first person I thought of, which was my insurance broker, and he walked me through the steps. Then I called the restoration company, and they actually explained to me even further the rest of the steps. And I guess my encouragement out there to any like new or aspiring landlords is just in time learning is okay. Like I did not need to read a handbook on what to do in case of death or suicide in your unit before buying any real estate. And really looking back, there's absolutely nothing I would have done differently as far as the protocol goes.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about what you've shared, I don't know that I have any tips or pointers to add there
Maybe
either. I mean,
I would have knocked on the door instead of calling the cops on those girls. But I was
I don't know that I would have
terrified.
done that. I mean,
I was terrified.
yeah, no, I feel I don't even know that I would have done that any differently. Maybe they didn't need to come out with their guns drawn, but
Guns
that's
drawn.
I won't step
Oh
on
my
police
God.
protocol either. I feel like when these types of situations happen, like what really resonates with me is that for us, this might be a business. For us, this might be, an investment, something that we're, trying to get some amount of financial reward from. But at the end of the day, like it is somebody's home. It is
Yes.
somebody's like life, their safe space. Like, and, there's a million different ways that like when things go wrong with our properties, it's going wrong in someone else's life, like our tenant's life
Yes.
or their livelihood if it's commercial real estate. And so kind of like you said, just kind of going through with compassion and patience, even if it's against your, better urges, it will probably get you through just as fine. And so thank you so much for sharing that really kind of upsetting, traumatic, also I think important story, because it may not always be a suicide, but having some sort of a tragedy or accident happen at a property is not a rare occurrence. And so having level-headedness, which I think you kind of show through here, even if, some parts were traumatic and some parts were scary, is really kind of the best that you can do, is to come through it like that.
Yeah, I think that the only thing, now that I'm thinking about it, the only thing I would have done differently is I just wish I would have never seen him on the stretcher for like months. Anytime I saw like average looking white 5'10" male with a beard, I saw him. And so I was really traumatized. And so, but it's like, I mean, what is the saying? Like, it's really hard to not look at the car crash, right? It's really hard to like, your curiosity gets you, but that would be the only thing I would have changed. I wish I would have never looked. My life would have been better without seeing him. And then oddly, I am glad that I like looked at my unit. Like, I think that my imagination saw like these terrible violent movies with like blood splatters on the ceiling. And as terrible as it really was quite contained, and it wasn't as bad as my imagination. And the whole process, it was quite quick, and the unit is restored. And I put some incense and cleared the juju and did my best to treat this as a business and just get the unit in a livable state again. And that's what we have to do as landlords.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for sharing it. Guys, if you want to connect with Sarah, I will leave her information in the show notes. But if you want to take a second real quick, Sarah, and let people know where they can find you, what you're up to, what you offer, all that good stuff.
Yeah, thank you so much. So hi, everybody. Again, it's Sarah Weaver. You can find me at Sarah D. Weaver, and I help investors furnish and launch their next furnished rental with my company, Aria Design Services. And so we travel the country furnishing units. And then I also teach investors how to invest out of state, meaning how the heck do I travel the world and own these rentals in the Midwest that I clearly need to spend less time at. Now I spend like no time visiting my units. and I'd love to help anyone. And so if anything resonated with you guys, feel free to reach out. Thank you, Bonnie, for having me.
Thanks so much for coming, Sarah. Always pleasure having you on. Thanks so much for listening to the House of Horrors podcast. Make sure to follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you like to listen to podcasts. You can also check out all of our podcast episodes, show notes, links, and more at bonniegalam.com/podcast. You can learn more about legally protecting your portfolio and take my free legal workshop, The 3 Legal Myths Preventing You from Securing and Scaling Your Portfolio, and of course what to do instead, at bonniegalam.com. And to stay connected and follow along, follow me on Instagram at bonniegalamesq and send me a DM to say hi.